Welcome to another technical presentation in design and manufacturing, brought to you by the Electronics Alliance. Today we bring you medical device cybersecurity, designing to expect an attack. We welcome Gerald Miles of the Real-Time Group.
Here's the agenda. I'm going to talk about the authority landscape for cybersecurity. There's several, and this will be from the main topic is UL 2900, and there are several divisions of the United States government that have interest in cybersecurity and interest in medical devices, even though it's really under FDA purview. A little bit about the background and then kind of the solution to the problem from a device standpoint, and then a little bit about the larger landscape. Then we'll wrap it up with some questions. Kind of a simplistic thing, but you're supposed to start with some humor, right? The cybersecurity issues are increasing because of the connectivity. There are more wireless connectivity, network, interconnected devices. And then there's a whole group of what we call wellness, general wellness devices that we all have. And those are kind of shading into the med device area. And so the FDA is probably going to start regulating them at some point. The velocity of change is increasing as well. And it far outpaces the ability of the regulatory bodies to keep up, because they can't envision what's going to happen next, typically, and then it takes a long time to get a statute regulation through the process. And then, so what they've come to is actually good for industry, which is a cooperative kind of posture with industry about how do we protect users and the device from intrusion and use that's not proved. So the legislative and regulatory authority for the cybersecurity requirements that I'll be talking about is on a national, state, and local level. There are legislative statutes, and they're pretty general, and then there are international regulations and policy expectations, and those will be kind of at the end. Here are the departments that have U.S. regulations in the cybersecurity or med device cybersecurity area. You'll notice that HIPAA is under HHS, which also FDA is under HHS as well. And then over on the connectivity side for business entities and is under the Department of Commerce, and they're the ones that issue the NIST standards. So for HIPAA, it's codified in 45 CFR 160, 162, and 164, which are codified regulations. This has been, it's got a long history, but it's really been, has the force of law since 1996. There was a privacy rule for individual health information, so the PII, and then a breach notification rule for unsecured protected health info in 2009. Those are the precursors to some of the stuff we're going to talk about today. So the FDA issued, when they started seeing this, they started issuing guidance documents. The first one was the PreMarket cybersecurity guidance document in 2014, and then and that has to do with everything you do from a design development standpoint before the device is released to the market. So it talks about all the things you got to do in your submission to meet the requirements or the expectations. And then the PostMarket came out a little later, and that's for everything that's on the market now. So all, how you do your surveillance and maybe devices that are on the market that didn't go through or don't comply with the guidance for the pre-market. And that was sort of the impetus for UL 2900. What they really wanted was a way to put all that guidance into one thing. So what I'm going to talk about is some of the elements of UL 2900, but they incorporate a lot of the expectations in the pre-market and post-market, if that makes sense. I don't have a table in here that shows you which clause in the guidance goes with which section in UL 2900, but it's available on the UL website. And then the latest thing is the Med Device Safety Action Plan, and I'll talk about that a little bit, and it kind of wraps some of this up, and it calls out UL 2900, so we'll talk about that some. So if you think about it from a kind of a higher level view, connection to a network is relative, for a med device is a relatively new feature, in the last 20 years. Connection to the internet is really new in the last 10 years, last decade. And there's this thought that med devices are considered easy to hack. There's lots of people that try to do it. And so cybersecurity is a new concept in that context. And there's been an exponential increase in the number of connected devices and components annually, and that's a very large increase every year. And then the threat landscape is very broad as well, so all those things together. So what's the alternative? I mean, you could not allow connectivity to the device, but then it would be less usable, right? Or some of the benefits of it being connected would not be available. So it's really considered that's not a path, right? If you got the CIO and of your company and the CISO, the security officer of your company together, and the CISO got his way, you wouldn't have any business because they would stop everything, right? So it's a balance, right? It's what do I need to do? What's the practical thing to do? How do I analyze what's going to happen? And then how do I take effective measures to properly mitigate, not eliminate, maybe prevent some, but properly mitigate the things that can happen. And so the benefits we think outweigh the risk. So the devices are going to continue to be connected. But you can suffer some problems with exposing patient data and patient safety and some business issues and profitability and brand reputation if you don't do this properly. Some of the headlines that I just grabbed over the last couple weeks, and there's a whole lot of these, like there's hundreds of these, so it's not going away, and there's more all the time. And there are big penalties for, especially later when I talk about the GDPR, there's huge penalties for exposing patient data depending on how many patients were exposed. Like all the way up to 20 million euros or 4% of your top line or something like that. It's a lot. So there have been recent reports of hackers harming med device users, either stealing data, ransomware, holding the user hostage or the device hostage, or they use the device as an entry point to the larger network, depending on where it is. I thought this was an interesting fact. Dick Cheney had his defibrillator wireless connectivity deactivated while he was in office because of fears that it could be hacked. So the solution here for the approach we need to take is what we call defensive design. Traditional design is centered around the intended use with some thought of unintentional misuse. That's not good enough anymore. The modern operating environment's not safe, so there's vulnerabilities, and we're not properly vetting those if we're not doing this defensive design. So we have to comprehend its operation in a hostile environment that we know it's going to be deployed in, and we have to include hardening of that employed network somehow. So, and that's a little bit outside the scope, but I wanted to bring that up. And this is kind of a graphic of that. So I'm going to talk about the first three rings here, the data, so the device itself, the data, the application, and the host. And then it's connected to the network and other things on the perimeter and some of the physical and policy, all those things. But mainly for this, it's the first three rings. Really, we have to understand what our threats are and then craft an effective mitigation to those, or prevention if we can. And so defensive design is going to center on system cybersecurity using the methods in the guidance, the UL 2900, and the medical device action plan. So the PreMarket Guidance is Guidance 1825, and it has several things that you'll hear again in the UL 2900. It asks you to identify your assets and threats and your vulnerabilities, assess the impact of those on the device, assess the likelihood of the threat and the vulnerability becoming exploited, determine the risk levels and suitable mitigation strategies, and assess the residual risk after the mitigation has been applied and your risk acceptance criteria based on that. So did you reduce it enough to make it acceptable? And what we use for that is UL 14971. If you were like an IT guy, you would use ISO 80001. So what they're kind of saying is they're expecting a cybersecurity risk assessment document that does a typical risk assessment type of analysis. So for identify and protect, you want to limit access to trusted users only with strong passwords, session timeouts, role-based access, and authentication before update. So if you're going to roll out a patch, you want to make sure it's actually has, is self-consistent and all those things, and it is the actual patch you intend to update with, and then you update and check it again, make sure. Ensure trusted content, so you restrict updates to authenticated code. You have systematic procedures for downloads and secure data transfer, and that implies sort of some encryption, or we do a double encryption or AES 256, things like that. Under detect, respond, recover, so we want to include features to enable detection and logging of compromises. So we want to, if anything weird happens, we want to log it. And we do typically log things about the operation of the device itself. We always log, logins, things like that, and actions taken to change the configuration of the device or to change its security settings or enable other users or things like that. So we can also put measures in to protect critical functionality in case there is a breach, if we detect it. And that could mean that we make the device partially not usable or something like that, but at least you didn't expose that to the breach, and the breach is contained. And then retention and recovery of the configuration if it's compromised. So, and the documentation they expect is, they don't come out and say it, but I, based on what I read, it implies they're expecting a cybersecurity risk analysis, kind of in the style of 14971, like your regular device system risk and hazard analysis. They want to see mitigation with design considerations. They want to see a specific list of cybersecurity risks, and they want to see a list and justification for all the controls and how. And they want to also see that they're connected to an actual requirement somehow, and that requirement is tested and verified and validated that it is effective at the time, is activated and effective at the time it's needed. And I want to see a summary of controls to ensure that there's integrity throughout software distribution. So that may mean procedures. You may have a set of procedures you have to establish to make sure that software is safely rolled out for updates and things like that, and through your manufacturing process as you put software on new devices. And then IFU specs related to cybersecurity controls are appropriate for the environment. So you could say you can only deploy this in a firewall environment, connected to a firewall network. So we'll go on to UL 2900. So that was the pre-market expectations. A lot of that is in UL 2900, and you'll notice that it calls out several other things. 14971 that I mentioned already. 62304 is a software lifecycle requirement. So that's kind of the Bible we live by in the software world about how we operate when we're developing software. 13485 is your facility quality system processes, and ISO 27700 we'll talk about later, and 80001 we mentioned already, and that's the IT risk management. So some general requirements. This is the top level standard. It defines the expectations. What it means though is expect an assessment by an accredited lab will be required, like for 60601, which is for the device safety itself, or 14971, which is called out by that standard. Industry-specific collateral standards for healthcare systems, industrial controls, and security and life safety signaling systems are under these particular standards or collateral standards. And then there are a couple of standards for general process requirements and security development lifecycle that are still in work and they'll be released soon. But they're all related to the same base general standard of 29001. So it also expects a set of product documentation for your product, a description of all the functions, including the management, a list of all the interfaces and inputs and outputs, and if you have remote access or local interfaces, wireless interfaces, inputs, you know, like what your file system looks like, and communication protocols. A list of executables libraries, including third-party and open source. So what they're kind of saying, and without saying it, is they're expecting a software bill of materials, just about. They want to see all the source code in the product, the binary code or bytecode decompiled, and then the build and integration process. And those are things, most of this we already produce, but wrapping it up into the package they want to see is going to be a new thing. Security risk analysis, which we kind of already talked about, and then design documentation that will allow them to enable their evaluation of the risk control implementation throughout the whole system, all the way from when the risk is analyzed and what the threat should be, all the way down to the mitigation and how it's tested to make sure it works. So they also want documentation for product use, which includes how to all the security instruction for use like normal, the interfaces and communication protocols, you would have configuration information about all of the software components in the product, a list of events, including security-related data logged, so we kind of talked about that already. Requirements and recommendations on the product configuration, and a document that the product's authentication method cannot be bypassed using less than exercising all elements. So they want to see that you can't short-circuit that process. Some of the foundational standards that they call out in UL 2900 are this list here. I don't want to go through the numbers, but it talks about digital signaturing, and there's a whole standard about that. The message authentication codes, entity authentication, how to do hashes, key management, because you have the public and private keys and all that, and then cryptographic techniques, so like the AES 256 encryption, algorithms, approved security functions, and then approved key establishment techniques, and that's across your whole landscape of how your device is designed and manufactured, and who controls the keys, and how do you safeguard the keys as well, because that can be an entry point. So as far as access, if there's security enabled, then authenticate, implement timeouts like we all are used to. You have to authenticate if you access the remote interface somehow. So services accessible over the wireless interface need authentication as well. Around usernames and passwords, you securely store the password, disable enumeration of valid usernames, require certain link complexity of passwords, protect against dictionary attacks and brute force attacks. If it's role-based access, then you have to document the roles and all the different requirements for each role and the limits of their privileges. Your risk controls have to be explicitly articulated as requirements in software, and that's one of the things we do is we make sure that when you do the risk analysis, your control is a real software requirement. It could be a method, it could be so if it's a process, it would call out the process document. If it's a method, then it would be a real software requirement because it's some functionality you have to include in the software as the mitigation. And then how to manage valid user accounts, enforcing the least privilege principle for every account and account type. If the session There's a lot, how do you re-authenticate? So not storing information about the current session, things like that, and make them re-enter all that. And then for the username password authentication, all the bypass. And then ensure, so I put this on a slide by itself because it's super important, ensure integrity and authenticity of all data. And that's something that we do a pretty good job of, but we have to keep it top of mind. So we put data protection on all the data that matters, all the configuration information that matters, all the configuration software. If we keep a version of software in memory that we can load, we've got to make sure it's authenticated. So cryptography, you can have multi-levels of this as well, but you make sure all your sensitive data are personally identified patient information data. If you generate it, then you've got to store it and you've got to maintain it properly. You've got to identify which data is sensitive data that you're maintaining inside your device, and use only approved cryptographic algorithms that have proven strength, and then use a separate cryptographic key for each service operation or function. Okay, so for product management, when we update the software, we want to make sure that we can roll it back if the update's not successful. So that is that implies you got to have more memory and things like that, and that you have to have a really solid bootloader that can do all that kind of thing. You want to verify the authenticity and integrity of the update cryptographically. You want to log all those security-related events like we talked about before, and store the security-related logs in non-volatile memory with no means to access for non-privileged users. And then require changes from default prior to initiation operations. So what that means is, like, you may manufacture your device with a default set of passwords, but it's got to be operated the first time, and all the passwords change to a unique password. When you decommission, set back to factory defaults and remove all of the data you collected. For product management, using only approved integrity methods for software updates. So that includes message authentication, code generated on software and firmware components. You're going to have digital signatures that you on each of the components, and then you have a hash for your components as well. And then it's got to be using one of those methods, so it's difficult to hack. And then all the mechanisms you do use need to comply with the foundational list that we talked about before. So for the risk management activity, UL 2900 expects that to occur as well. So they're applying a cybersecurity risk assessment also. You have to ID all the functions and data stored, processed, and used. Then you list all your threats and functionalities and data. You do your impact assessment per threat. So operational impact or data exposure possibility, and that becomes your severity in your table. And then the likelihood of occurrence, and then risk acceptability. So you have to figure out your acceptability criteria, and sometimes it's a business decision as well, because you may say that something is more important as far as acceptability than something else, and it may not be a technical reason, it may be a business reason that needs to set it to a more stringent control. And then you want to figure out what your controls are. What controls can I possibly put in place to mitigate this bad thing that could happen? And then you have to, as you do that, then you have to figure out, now what's my ranking of my assessment of the residual risk after you've applied those controls. And then you want to use a classification scheme for risk per the common attack pattern enumeration classification and the DREAD model. And those are they're available in the standard. They point you to where you can get that. And then when you document your risk evaluation method of known vulnerabilities, you want to use accepted criteria to evaluate the level of risk for each one, establish the risk limit, and then you want to look at the factors in the CDSS score those are online as well. And I have a link in later on to that. And then if allowing presence of known vulnerabilities, so there may be a library using your software and it has a certain vulnerability, but you're saying, I acknowledge it and I'm going to mitigate it for this reason. The CVE standard vulnerability identifier needs to be included in your documentation if you're going to do that, because you're kind of taking an exception to the standard. And then the software location of the vulnerability and the risk analysis showing it's acceptable. So you want to document the risk evaluation method of known weaknesses, the criteria used to evaluate each level of risk for each weakness, the common weakness risk analysis framework, establish the risk acceptability limit, understand the factors considered in the CWSS and its intended use in its environment. And then if you're allowing weaknesses to exist, same thing occurs. You've got to document it. You've got to say where it is, why it's okay, and a risk analysis around that to say why there's other compensating controls that further reduce it so that it's okay. The compliance function will then review the documentation and assess it for sufficient coverage in regards to functionality, data, threats, and impact. They want to see sufficient adoption of risk controls or justifying why you haven't implemented a control. If it scores out low enough, you may not put an actual control in place and say it's acceptable as is. And then they want to see sufficient implementation of risk controls, which implies a whole lot of things, including traceability to actual requirements that actually get tested, verified, and validated, and that show that they're effective at the time they're needed. And then they're going to evaluate the assessment of vulnerabilities and weaknesses that are present, and they're going to look through your traceability on those, because that'll raise their antennas a lot. So for vulnerabilities and exploits for design tests, this is just a table of or examples. So say you had a code or bytecode shall contain no known vulnerabilities. How you would do that is you evaluate the code or bytecode for known vulnerabilities per the vulnerability database. No malware, so you have to do an inspection, and then unexpected behavior when subject to invalid or unexpected inputs on external interfaces. What do we do with that? We conduct actual demonstrated malformed testing to make sure that we don't respond to that. Structured penetration testing is important as well. We want to see how durable or how hardened the device is. And you try to do this with these types of attacks, including denial of service, access via unauthorized means, so you're kind of trying to get around the authentication process. Exploit other vulnerabilities per the risk analysis, and try to elevate the privileges to allow yourself to get into areas you shouldn't get into in the product. And you're going to use things like port scans and sniffers and things like that, and you'll have a formal test plan that describes how you plan to do this penetration testing.
Carol? Is there any requirement that you have an outside entity do this pen testing?
There's not a requirement because usually you have a separate group. So the R&D group doesn't do this testing. The test group will do that. And it doesn't really matter who does the testing as long as you collect the correct objective evidence that it does it does this when I do that. Then you've got objective evidence that anyone, even a reviewer or even an external test lab, could verify that, yeah, it works properly. You can have an external group do that. We do, at Real Time, we do some external, we're the third-party tester for others who develop for these kind of things as well. But it's not a requirement necessarily, but the requirement is you got to have objective evidence about how this works, about what the results are when you do something like that.
So I was prompted by that next to last bullet in the blue box, exploit vulnerabilities that were flagged as acceptable, because that's a requirement for creativity on the part of the exploiter.
Sure.
And so
Yeah,
you
because
be motivated to break it.
well, we in the R&D group we designed two requirements. The test group, their their set is the infinite set, right? They can
Right.
test everything or whatever they can imagine. Now it's bounded by, if you want to do test theory, it's bounded by equivalence classes and all that, and to say, hey, this test is not interesting because it's in the same equivalence class as this other one, but coming up with those kind of classes of tests to do is a creative thing. But it's a destructive, prove it to me, I don't believe it, that it works kind of thing.
Okay.
Hey Carol, can you talk a little bit more about compliance verification for denial of service attack? If the device, if something's online, it's vulnerable, right? I mean, there's really...
It's vulnerable, yeah.
And the only way to stop a DOS is to take the IP offline or to change the IP if that's possible, right? I mean, is there anything else
Well,
there?
what you want to look for is, does it bring it to its knees when it's kind of responding to that DOS, or can the device still be operated in that environment? And what you want to do is make sure you can still operate it and not, or if you get the same request from the same requester, every millisecond or whatever, I don't know what you do, but you either go into a fail-safe. It depends on what the device is and where you're at in its operation. If you're actually doing patient interaction, then you're going to treat it differently than you would if it's just powering up and then it gets hit with a DOS right away and it hasn't actually done any patient supporting or patient energy to or from the patient at that point. So I think it's device by device and situation by situation.
Okay, thanks.
So we talked about weaknesses earlier, so shall contain no weaknesses unless it's the acceptable kind. And then some of the techniques we use for that is the static code analysis, which is kind of a standard thing we do on everything. And it's a set of tools that run over the code and collect all the metrics about it and identify areas where you go array out of bounds or something, and it gives us a list of things to go and fix in the code to make sure that it is self-consistent and doesn't go off the rails. And then static binary bytecode analysis. So then here's some links to some of the common weakness information and top 10 list resources. So the CVE is the CVSS and the weakness and the scoring system and the attack pattern enumeration classification. So if you build your test plan based on this, you're going to be in a good place. And there's other creative things you're going to do as a tester, but this is a good start. That was UL 2900. So what they intended was to capture all of the FDA pre-market and post-market. So now we'll talk about the post-market. There's not much to it. It does have some of the same things that are in UL 2900, and you'll see that. So it's for fielded devices. Maybe they had the benefit of the pre-market guidance and they're good. Maybe they didn't. So just to talk about that. So you want to monitor the cybersecurity world out there and see for devices that are similar to yours that have similar interfaces. Are there new vulnerabilities and risks that are coming up? And that's a hard thing to do unless you have some aggregator that can do it for you. There's subscription services too, but that costs money. And then you want to maintain a robust software lifecycle process. So you're monitoring your third-party software. So if you have a graphics library that you included in your code, and there are a list of errata or known problems with it, you want to keep up with that. Make sure that when you did your SOUP analysis, which is software of unknown provenance, you included analysis of that because it could affect how your device operates in the field. And you've got to notify in our case, you've got to notify the customer. And then B&D for updates and patches to remediate vulnerabilities. So that's good and bad because when you allow updates, that's a vulnerability, but it also can fix other vulnerabilities. So managing the update capability is a big thing. And then maintaining the security risk profile so it can change over time as threats change. And then the disclosure policy. So this is a very sensitive subject. From a technical standpoint, we'll disclose what I'm seeing, we're very open. But from a business standpoint, not very many med device companies want to talk about their problems, right? It's sort of a, sit down on the couch and tell me what's wrong thing. So there are expectations, though, that you share information about things that you're seeing so that the industry can be protected. And then making sure you maintain your essential performance of your device, which is sometimes difficult to do, especially if you didn't include the right telemetry in your device so you know what's happening. You want to update your cybersecurity information for your PMA devices in your PMA periodic report that's required every year. I think it's a year, right? And then you want to participate in the information sharing and analysis organization. So that's a big expectation of the FDA, even though it's a little bit antithetical to med device folks. So they put policy in place for sharing. They want active sharing, and they want you to be a member and actually participate. Okay, so there's a new guidance, but they call it the Medical Device Safety Action Plan. And they stated that they need it because they regulate so many devices, 190,000 different devices worldwide, manufactured by 18,000 different firms in 21,000 different facilities. So they think they want to try to standardize. The framework is they want to establish a robust med device patient safety net, so they're kind of thinking about the patient more, and then they want to look into regulatory options to streamline and modernize the timely implementation of post-market mitigation, which means responding to something that happens after the device is in the market. And they want to spur innovation towards safer devices somehow, and that control group, they think, will do that. And then they'd like to advance the state of the art of the med device cybersecurity across the whole landscape. And what that means is integrating CDRHs. CDRH is the Center for Device and Radiologic Health. So it's the division of the FDA or the center of the FDA that regulates med devices. And they want to integrate the pre- and post-market offices together to make sure they have a total product lifecycle approach to device safety. So some of the current post-market safety and effectiveness tools are MDRs. A lot of people have heard of MDRs. Something bad happens at a facility, they have to fill out a facility MDR, like it's an infusion pump or something. If you're a device manufacturer and you get notified of an issue, you have to fill out an MDR. And if there's something that happens at a facility and you're a manufacturer and they don't see yours and match them up, then you're going to have a problem. They'll come and audit you right away. There's the Medical Product Safety Network. Is really important under the new EU MDR. I'll talk a little bit about that. Post-market surveillance studies, or 522 studies, or what they're called. Pre-market approval application annual report. So what they're seeing as a state of the art on the pre-market side, they want that to fold into somehow how we look at post-market things. Scientific literature review. So there's always scientific advancement, and they want to take advantage of that as part of the process as well. And then inspection of devices management and QMS, so they learn a lot about devices and kind of the state of the art as they, if you think about it across the whole landscape of manufacturers, you're going to get a real good look at the, what's the best practices that are happening right now and the associated QMS world. And then manufacturer reports for corrections and removals, which is kind of the answer to the MDRs. So manufacturers are trying not to get their device recalled, so they're going to do corrections and removals voluntarily, possibly. And then complaints, and usually you don't get complaints very often, but usually they're serious when they do. A lot of times it's by your competition, so you gotta be on your toes. So the post-market safety effectiveness enhancements per the safety action plan are the implementation of UDI, which is the device identification database, so your device will get allocated a set of numbers, and then as you release them, you're going to be assigned a UDI, and then they know which device it is and where it came from and provenance and all that. It's almost like it's birth certificate, right? And then this is a big requirement for MDR, so we'll see more about that. Regulatory clarity via real-world evidence, so they want to feed back into the regulatory changes or contemplated changes, real-world things that they're seeing that they want to, I guess, generate a regulation for. And then develop a national evaluation system for health technology. I don't know, I think there's been a meeting or two on this, but I don't know the current status. And it's a public-private med device innovation consortium. And I know there's been invitations that have gone out on that. And they're supposed to provide active surveillance and evaluation across industry and the regulatory bodies. So a signal management program, and what it's concerned with is transferring the post-market signals to pre-market reviews and associated in some way. So what's the post-market thing I'm seeing, and what could we have done in the pre-market arena to mitigate against that, I guess. And then recalibration of the benefit risk framework if you need to, based on the oversight in the pre and post-market settings. And then they really want to create a competitive marketplace for device quality. So what they're saying, and I agree with this, just complying with the regulations is not enough from a competitive standpoint. You've got to be a lot better performance-wise than what the regulations require. So in other words, industry is going to stay ahead of the regulatory bodies forever. And then they want to address cybersecurity of med devices as a patient safety concern. So they're reframing that discussion to say, what does it mean for the patient when you have this issue with the device, or and when I say device, it could be a combination device that has a drug with it or a biologic with it. And then they're looking for a multifaceted approach to vigilance, responsiveness, recovery, and resilience to it through the total product life cycle. So the benefits are that they feel the risk-benefit framework is going to be robust due to the TPLC approach. They'll get really timely use incident to effect on the use landscape in a closed loop. And they'll be able to streamline and modernize post-market mitigations, spur innovation toward the safer med devices. They're going to create this competitive landscape. And then they want to advance the medical device cybersecurity. And I think I mentioned this earlier. They want to really go towards the software bill of materials, which is probably not a bad idea. We document the configuration now, but I think a more careful documentation of that you'll be able to find, you'll get some insights. If you do this, you'll get some insights you wouldn't get any other way of common causes. And then incentivize a coordinated disclosure of vulnerabilities, which is folks are reluctant to do. And then there'll be this CyberMed expert analysis board, and it's mainly like PhD at universities and things like that that are looking into vulnerabilities that we're just not thinking about at our practitioner level. And then integration of the CDRH pre and post-market offices at the FDA so that they're more aligned with managing the device from end to end, from birth to decommission. Why did they put this out? They are recognizing, or they're saying, that safe and effective doesn't mean risk-free. So that is probably the biggest thing. And then they really want information sharing, the post-market information affecting the pre-market activities in a control loop. And then they want the best practices to come out and enhance the quality of all devices and raise the standard of the industry. Here are some of the standards. If you remember, I talked about just the first 3 rings, but here are some of the standards for some of the other rings. One of them is NIST 1.1, and it's a framework for improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity, so it's mainly in the network and perimeter area. It's voluntary, but not really as an expectation. So you can say it's voluntary, but if they expect it, they're going to ask you about it. Now, it doesn't mean you have to address every clause, but you will need to adjust your procedures appropriately. And then really take a look at IEC 27001 for information security management. That'll be super important. And I think at some point they're going to codify that one, and you'll be asked about that. And then 80,001 -1 is the risk management for IT networks. So just like we do for devices with 14971, you have to do this for your network. And what are all the ways it can fail? What are all the risks, risks and vulnerabilities and weaknesses and all that, and how are you managing that? And then Texas actually has the EIR, it's their agency security plan. So they really rolled it out to Texas agencies that are state agencies, but at some point they're going to have some state-related expectations, I believe. Not like California, but you'll see some. And then there's the international cybersecurity regulations and policies. You've all seen GDPR things happen already because it came out in 2018 in May, I believe. The INSA, the EU Agency for Network and Information Security, and the NIS directive for network and information systems. So a little bit more about NIST. It was created through an executive order by the president. And it's supposed to improve critical infrastructure cybersecurity. They wrote NIST 1.1 in 2014, and then April 2018 1.1 to include some of the things that are that we talked about in UL 2900. And then it incorporates a lot of the things and calls out ISO 27001 for information security management. And these are the five areas that they kind of organized around. Identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. That's the framework. And it's a very similar framework to what Texas did in the DIR for this agency security plan for their IT systems. And it was a collaboration between government and the private sector, so that's why it looks familiar. And then the 5 simultaneous functions. And then there are the 40 distinct security objectives underneath this, and it's a lot like NIST, but different in certain ways. In the international side, UK has this Secure by Design initiative they have going. I didn't include information about it here, but if you're interested, you can look it up. GDPR, we've all heard about. It came out in May 2018. If there's some heavy fines for not complying with this, so you've all had to accept yes for cookies on certain websites and all that stuff, and that's GDPR that did that. And then the MDR, IVDR, so the MDR is the medical device regulation. And a little bit about this, the EU, what they had before was the EEC, which is the directive. And it doesn't really have the force of law. So they were jealous of us. Our FDA regulations have the force of law. Theirs was just a directive. So it didn't really have the teeth and all the penalties and all that stuff that our FDA regulations had. So they went and said, we're going to write the MDR, and the IVDR is for in vitro diagnostic devices. We're going to write the MDR, and what they did is they went like 0 to 60 in milliseconds because they've got theirs regulated. They went way past what the FDA requires, and it's going to be a huge change for everybody. So, summary time. So cybersecurity threats are increasing. We have a robust 14971 risk management program is required that looks at all the cybersecurity threats and vulnerabilities. Defensive high reliability design practices, including encryption of communication paths, data integrity checks, highly partitioned architecture, 62304 software lifecycle, static analysis coding standard is going to be essential. We want to ensure the integrity and authenticity on remote access connections, and robust monitoring of breaches in medical device reports and actually report it, and then participate in an information sharing organization. And you're going to have to address cybersecurity in the software section of your submission, either your 510K or your PMA. And then really, the bottom line is effective cybersecurity program makes good business sense. If you just do what is required by the regulations, you're not doing enough probably. So all the things I mentioned, you're going to have to do more than that. And there are companies that have third-party tools and methods that they can help you with that go a lot further than all the things that I talked about today. And there's some that are members of Titans as well. And they really do a good job of keeping up with the latest threat network and what's happening and what things you need to do to make sure you stay in a good place with your device and its connectivity.